Welcome to Meditation.Podcast, episode 7. I'm Peter.
I'm Jeff.
And I'm Will.
Are you breathing right now? In today's podcast, we'll be talking about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. First, we'll provide a few definitions of what I just said. We'll introduce the 4 books or parts of the Yoga Sutras, and we'll begin our investigation into Book 1, called Samadhi Para, with Yoga Sutras 1:1 or 1.1 and 1.2. Jeff, Will, any opening thoughts before we commence?
No.
Why is there a dot over your dot, turning it into a colon?
I kind of have an affinity for colons.
Okay. Let's go with colons.
Definitions. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. These are a collection of short, condensed phrases which codify the theory and the practice of yoga. Here we're using a different definition of the word yoga than is commonly known here in the West, and we'll get into that in a moment. The sutras are packed with meaning and can be quite cryptic. So over many years, thousands of years, quite a few people have written commentaries and translations to help aid in their understanding. Within the Yoga Sutras, the principles of Ashtanga Yoga are enumerated and described in some detail. Ashtanga Yoga is a yoga of 8 limbs or parts of the practice. And an earlier meditation podcast, episode 4, Jeff and I explore Ashtanga Yoga in a bit more depth. The word yoga itself, etymologically, means union or to join. And now you might ask, to join what with what? Generally, it refers to an integrated state called samadhi, which one experiences through control of thought waves in the mind. And that's one of the Yoga Sutras, one of the very first ones, which we'll explore in more detail shortly. The word sutra means thread or string. And here, colloquially, or more commonly refers to an aphorism, or a collection of aphorisms, short condensed phrases, which usually are used to convey a body of knowledge and are easy to memorize. And this person, Patanjali, a mythical figure, may have existed, may have been a persona invented later, hard to say. But legend has it that he was an Indian sage who was the first to compile in writing the Yoga Sutras. Prior to that, they were memorized and transmitted orally.
It doesn't mean that he invented yoga.
He actually did not. I mean, that's pretty clear that he did not. In fact, the very first sutra that we'll look at in a minute kind of implies now the teachings of yoga are continued or are codified. Not I'm giving you the teachings of yoga, but merely I'm codifying them and relating them as they've already been taught for thousands of years or however long. So
like the bestseller of his day about yoga.
Pretty much, yeah. So what are the 4 books that comprise the Yoga Sutras? The word padas literally means foot or steps. So the 4 steps of yoga, or the 4 parts. There's 4 different books. Each has about 50 sutras, more or less. So about 200 total. I think it's actually 196. The first book, Samadhi Para, and there's that word samadhi again, which has different translations and meanings to people, but generally it's that integrated state or complete absorption. It's also translated as contemplation, which leads to absorption. Or here, super consciousness, meaning a state of mind that is beyond the normal state of mind. The normal state of mind being discursive and moving about. Whereas in a superconscious state, you're focused entirely on one object or no objects. So that's Samadhi Para. Sadhana Para. Sadhana is a word that implies a daily practice or a discipline or a set of methods, where Patanjali codifies in a bit more detail what are the actions that you take every day to practice Ashtanga yoga, or really it's meditation. Both the preliminary life steps to prepare yourself for a successful meditation practice and actual various things you can meditate on to achieve samadhi.
It's kind of like book 1 is the goal, and book 2 is the means.
Exactly. Book 3, Vibhuti Para. Vibhuti is powers. It's noted that if someone earnestly commits time and effort to the practice, they have positive effects from that practice, accomplishments. Some of them may appear mystical and even magical. The purpose of introducing the powers is not necessarily to let people know what they should be looking for, quite the reverse, to let people know what the side effects are, and some of these things should be avoided in the pursuit of the goal of yoga. But nonetheless, it serves as a useful reference of positive things that could happen in your ability to concentrate and other areas of life as a result of yogic practice. Finally, the fourth book, Kaivalya Pada, implies that once someone has practiced for a while and perhaps reached a state of sort of stable samadhi, now what? There's some dispute historically whether or not Kaivalya Pada was part of the original Yoga Sutras, or perhaps added later as a refutation to one of the Buddhist doctrines of dependence. I don't know a lot about that claim, but I thought I would note it. Thoughts?
Yeah, so Kaivalya, I don't, it's sort of like, is that like the yoga version of nirvana or something? It's like a
Isolation.
exalted state or something.
Yeah. Isolation, liberation. Almost like a bodhisattva in a way, like suddenly you've achieved this state, but you're still here, now what?
Ah, okay.
I think.
Is book 3 like, so I'm going to be successful in my career and people are going to like me?
You're going to be able to levitate.
Yeah. Okay, so it's all of that.
Yeah.
More of the levitation, though, right? And less of the personal success.
Some of the powers listed in Vibhuti Pada are difficult to take, particularly from a contemporary Western perspective where we're not used to the reality of magical powers. I don't mean to, it doesn't really sound like that, but some of the powers described sound pretty amazing. We'll get there. That's way, way out. We're only in book 1 right now, Samadhi Pada. And we haven't even gotten to the first sutra yet.
We want the powers now.
Yeah, I was told there'd be powers.
If there were going to be powers, we'd have to be charging for this. But unfortunately, it's free. The work was free.
Powers.
Work was free. Keep it so. All right, book 1, Samadhi Para, a little more detail. the word samadhi literally means putting or joining together. I think that's the same etymology as for the word art. The word art means to put together or join together. So I guess if you are good at samadhi, you're an artist. In practice, samadhi can be translated as absorption, and kind of mental absorption is what we're talking about. Complete absorption in the object of concentration, or integration, like an integrated state. To borrow pop psychology, integration between the lower self and the higher self, the lower mind and the higher mind. To borrow from a religious paradigm, integration of the individual isolated spirit with the supreme overarching spiritual force. Or maybe just peace of mind is a good way to describe it. Another way.
Yoga means joining too, though. But this is
Well,
like,
yes. However, someone has disputed that another etymology of yoga is contemplation, and that is actually the correct definition, the correct etymology to base the definition on in the context of the Yoga Sutras. Contemplation, which brings about an integrated state.
but this is something that happens like a lot for us as modern day people reading the Yoga Sutras, is there'll be like Sanskrit terms that you think mean the same thing, but once you sort of like learn them all together, the subtleties between them, like samadhi, it's like a little bit more about like an individual consciousness, like what it does to join to whatever.
The base, like the peaceful, like you're coupling with another dimension or state, which is like a peaceful or a base state. And so samadhi is that kind of mental transition or state. I've also seen it translated just as contemplation, concentration, or meditation, which have subtle differences in meaning, those three words. But and then superconsciousness, which I think is what Hari Das describes it as, superconsciousness. Etymology: Sam, D, Sam, perfect or complete, D, or D, consciousness. Perfect or complete consciousness, samadhi. Another way I thought of this, an integrated consciousness, is in relation to our normal state of mind, which is discursive. We're always having new thoughts. It's hard nowadays to hold the same thought for more than a second before a new thought arises. But so the consciousness is all over the place. The mind is all over the place. And now we're bringing it to one place, kind of integration. We're bringing all the power of consciousness into one place, either on some external object, some internal object, or completely controlling the need for the mind to rest on an object at all and resting in complete emptiness. In book 1, Samadhi Para, the pivotal and basic axiom of the whole yoga system is presented. It's actually the second sutra, which we will cover in more detail in a moment. But in English, shortly, it's yoga is control of thought waves in the mind. Yoga, meaning the state or the state of samadhi, is achieved by control or cessation of thought waves in the mind. And then various methods are introduced in Samadhi Para to achieve that state. And various levels of samadhi are described. It's not quite so black and white, but it's a bit fuzzy logic-like, with gradients. Ready for Yoga Sutra 1:1?
1.1.
We're gonna use dots later, I bet.
Yoga Sutra 1:1 or 1.1. We could even go with a semicolon, but I think that would be grammatically incorrect. In Sanskrit, and apologies to all of you proper Sanskrit people, my pronunciation may not be perfect, but we're trying out here. We're trying our best. Artha Yoganu Shasana. Artha Yoganu Shasana. Artha, and in English this means now, right now at this auspicious moment. The teachings of yoga, or the teachings of yoga are contained in this now. Artha means now, or at an auspicious moment of transition. Usually when Artha is used in the beginning of a set of sutras or religious scriptures, it sort of implies auspicious moment. It's sort of a respected word, just like the word Om is. So now, okay, now that we're all here, the teachings of yoga, and here yoga meaning samadhi or contemplation, anu are within this, and then shasana, discipline or teachings. That's the first sutra. And we'll elaborate on this a little bit. Here again, the etymology of the word yoga, the verb yuj, or yuj, to join or restrain. I've also seen it described etymologically as contemplation. So hard to get to the bottom of that one without a time machine and help from Bill and Ted. Similar, interestingly, to the word yoke in English, which means to join or to bring together. I think that works for yoga practices, which are often about restraining. I mean, you're not letting the mind wander off in the form of thoughts. So that is a kind of a holding back, a yoking. And yoga is both a method, these are the things that you need to do to achieve samadhi, and a mental state, the state of samadhi. An integrated state. Sometimes yoga is used to describe that. And as a mental state, yoga means samadhi, superconsciousness. Either based on complete absorption in a single object of knowledge, or complete absorption beyond any object where all thought waves have completely ceased, which is, enormously difficult to achieve, particularly with how we grew up here in the West, where we're trained and paid to think a lot, just the opposite. And for many people who sit down to try to meditate, the first thing they notice is how busy their mind is, which is part of the practice. So this last bit, samadhi is an attribute of the mental field. That phrase I lifted from Baba Hari Das, his rendition of the Yoga Sutras, because I wanted to explore it a bit further. The mental field can be described as having 5 general states. So, and you can relate this to yourself at various points in your life or even during the day. Maybe your mind is mudha, which means sort of stupefied, a state of confusion or stupor. Certainly if you're under the influence of chemicals, you can be in a state of stupor, or maybe some accident, some violent event has happened. Calming down a little bit, we get to chitta, which is a restless or disturbed mind, where you're no longer confused. You're somewhat present in your current environment, but your mind is still unsteady and extremely active, extremely discursive, hopping from thought to thought, looking around at different objects as if they presented a threat to you. You've probably seen people that are calming down from that, we get to vikshipta. So we're not quite extremely active, but we're still distracted. The mind here is fit for concentration, but still subject to distraction.
This is me most of the time.
Yeah. I think a lot of people in the current context have just a distracted mind, which is, now you can yoke it. You can start to practice concentration. From there, we settle down a bit and start to get into the shades of samadhi, ekagra, one-pointed, where the mind can focus and be held on a single object of concentration, maybe for a few seconds only, maybe for a few minutes, maybe for 10 or 20 minutes. And then finally, we get to this fifth state of mind, nirodhah. This is the controlled or restrained state of mind where the mind is completely still and devoid of object. And that's the super rare one that you get from the accomplished yogis, maybe the Buddha or the Buddhas, who've had enough time through persistent practice and dispassion to actually get to a state of mind where it no longer obsessively and addictively needs to have an object in it to rest on or to take the form or shape of. Going to the next one.
Yep. I'm in a state of mudha right now.
This is the big one. This is the big one right here. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodhah. Yoga Sutra 1:2 or 1.2. 1,2? Would you do a 1,2? Would that work?
No, that would be a disaster. A colon or a dot are okay. Either way is fine.
What about the 2 colons? I was thinking of going with 2 colons, the scope resolution operator in C++, but I don't think that's generally accepted.
No, I don't think that would be right at all.
It happens to be my personal favorite operator.
Out of the room.
It's always been my favorite operator, scope resolution operator.
If you want to be really fancy, you could use Roman numerals.
Control of thought waves in the mind is yoga, or yoga is the stilling of the changing states of mind. That's Edwin Bryant, the last one, stilling the changing states of mind. Control of thought waves in the mind is yoga, not the stretching exercises that you see in the window downtown. But that has a part. That's still important stuff. I just want to point out, let's not conflate the 2 terms here. Certainly you have to have a calm mind when you're standing on one hand. So yoga, chitta, the mind field, the mental field, the place in which feelings and thoughts occur. Vritti, modifications, fluctuations, or waves, the thoughts themselves. A completely peaceful chitta would have no vritti, no thoughts or modifications. And then nirodhah, the verb, to control, to suppress, restrain, arrest, stop, or block. I often think of information theory when I read this. In the simplest form, 2 terminals connected with a wire, one terminal communicating to the other terminal by modulating a carrier wave, changing the amplitude or the frequency of the carrier wave to represent information. When there's no information to convey, the carrier wave is simply a sine wave. When we want to transform or imprint information on top of that carrier wave, we modulate its frequency or its amplitude. That's the vritti of the chitta vritti. The nirodhah is the verb, the ability to control that so that it's the signal that you want, or to completely eliminate it, to bring it down to just back to the normal peaceful, placid state. So the elaboration of this sutra, once again, yoga defined as both the method and the state. Here as the method, the practice of nirodhah, mental control, by which union is achieved. That's the method. As the state, samadhi, has been described variously, such as evenness of mind, or skill into action, which immediately makes me think of Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, describing skill in action. Or the Buddha saying skillful action. Doesn't he say something like that, Jeff?
Yeah. That's the word. We were talking about this actually before the episode. Kusala and akusala. Kusala is skillful or wholesome, sometimes translated. But yeah.
Absence of pain, another definition of yoga. Or when the senses are firmly under control, which results in an absence of pain. So broad reaching definitions of the word yoga here. Yoga chitta vritti. Vritti here means to revolve. Vrittis are the thought waves that revolve in the mind being the chitta. In this context, the thought waves include all thoughts, whether they're sort of cognitive thoughts that you're aware of or subliminal repressed thoughts that are going on, but we're not aware of them. They're just there in the background. Chitta vritti includes emotions, memories, intuitions, imaginations, and can be translated as mental modifications or fluctuations. Basically our normal waking state. The etymology vrit, which I believe is the same etymology for the word universe, verse, to turn, to revolve. Uni meaning one turning, one as if we're all turning it together. But here, to turn, proceed, move, and that concept vrit can be seen in the always active discursive state of the mind, always revolving, always turning, always moving. A little more, I guess we'll call it yoga psychology or yoga metaphysics here. Every thought, every chitta vritti creates a samskara, which means a mental impression, a mental recording, a mental image, which is stored in the chitta and remains there, potentially dormant, until at some point in the future it gets activated or stirred up again by some resonance in the present environment, at which point it becomes active and a new thought arises. So maybe a chitta vritti involves some painful incident, as an example, where, I don't know, a dog bit your finger. Now you've got this mental impression of this happening. And it's sort of in the background, forget about it. A few years later, you see a dog bite someone else's finger. And there's a resonance there, a commonness. And so your memory gets stirred up. And maybe comes to your active awareness, or maybe it's submerged. But that's the concept here. So we get into this cycle where a new vritti is created, conditioned by the past impression, and it creates another impression. And the feedback loop continues, and off we go to the races. Totally attached and absorbed in the contents of the mind. How do we get out of this loop? And what happens when we do? So nirodhah is the verb in the Yoga Sutra, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodhah. And it's different than repression or suppression. We're not trying to repress thoughts or prevent them from happening. Instead, it's control. It's the selectivity that you use in concentration, where you choose. It's an act of will to choose to focus on one object, to the exclusion of other objects, other distracting thoughts, other distracting perceptions. Other perceptions arise, other thoughts arise, and instead of having anything to do with trying to repress them, you simply continue to focus on your chosen object of concentration, which might be nothing. It might be emptiness, or it might be an object external or internal. That's nirodhah. Now, in later sutras, which we'll begin to cover one after the other, Patanjali indicates that by regular practice, abhyasa, meaning practice of meditation, practice of controlling thought waves in the mind, and by dispassion, by developing dispassion, kind of a detachment, sort of a letting go of the desires and the aversions that cling us to objects in the first place.
Like my passionate desire for levitation.
That could be an entrapment.
Yeah, I feel that.
So by regular practice, abhyasa, and dispassion by ragya, the thought waves are controlled. So he emphasizes regular practice. Some meditative framework, whether it's a Buddhist framework, a yogic framework, Zen, contemporary Western spiritual meditation, there's a lot of cultural contexts that have this. And the regularity of it, like daily or several times daily, combined with dispassion, through those practices, the thought waves are eventually controlled. And they attenuate as you continue. Thoughts? You mean we've achieved nirodhah?
Yeah, so what happens when you achieve nirodhah? This is a goal,
Ah,
a sustained goal, a temporary state?
that is Yoga Sutra 1:3.
Oh no. Okay, we'll stick with 1 2.
That is the cliffhanger. In fact, the first word of Yoga Sutra 1:3 is ta-da, which means then, meaning when the thought waves are controlled. You're going to have to tune in to the next meditation podcast to get to the answer of that cliffhanger.
Oh, that was a pretty good transition.
Nice.
Any closing thoughts, arguments? Shall we call it a day?
Now.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us on Meditation.Podcast. We will see you again next time. Yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodhah.